It is the most dishonest general election campaign in memory, or at least has the potential to be. Not just boring, not just dry, not just tedious, not just significant, but dishonest. The most dishonest in modern times. That's the view of Tory grandee and peer Michael Heseltine today, who's been writing about the dishonesty that he sees in this election campaign. We are now at the start, he writes in The Independent, of what I foresee will be the most dishonest election of modern times. Why does he think that? Why is it dishonest? He continues, the state of our economy, defence and environment, the need to level up our society, control immigration and restore Britain's standing in the world, none of these issues can be honestly addressed in isolation from our relationship with Europe, yet Europe is the no-go area. Interesting. Very interesting indeed. So what Lord Heseltine is saying there is the parties aren't talking about Brexit. It is the elephant in the room in this election. And unless they start to do so, unless they start to talk about the impact that leaving the EU has had on all the things he just mentions, they will not be being honest with the British people. I wonder if you agree with that. I wonder if you, like Lord Heseltine, think that the parties need to address this head on, that they need to start talking about Brexit, they need to start offering more when it comes to, I don't know, delivering on Brexit, you might think, getting on with finding the advantages or overseeing the changes that resulted from leaving the EU. You might think that. You might think the government hasn't done enough to seize on the opportunities that you might feel Brexit presented. Or perhaps you're of the opposite view. Perhaps your frustration isn't that we haven't done enough to make Brexit work, but that actually the parties, none of them, are promising to undo some of the damage. Maybe you'd like to see Keir Starmer, the Lib Dems, whoever it is, stand up and say, this was nonsense, it was a massive mistake, we now know that, the people of this country think it was a mistake according to the polls, let's be honest, we should go back in. Maybe that would win your vote. Or you might be of the view, and I do think I'd probably fall more into this category than the others, that it's time to move on. That yes, we can have the conversation about the consequences of Brexit, we can rehash those old arguments. But actually, in some way, it's a breath of a fresh air to have an election campaign that isn't dominated completely by whether or not we are a member of the European Union. That actually there are far more important issues in this election that, as Lord Heseltine says, might be linked to Europe, but ultimately are mostly separate to that issue. Is Brexit featuring enough in this debate? If it's not, what would you like to hear the parties saying on it? Or actually, are you quite relieved that we are perhaps starting the process of moving on, healing slightly from the deep rifts and divisions that were blown open by the 2016 Brexit referendum and everything that followed and stemmed from it? 0345 6060 973. Do you agree with Lord Heseltine that the parties aren't talking about it enough, that it's dishonest for them not to do so? Come to your thoughts on that in just a moment. Let's talk to him first, shall we? Lord Michael Heseltine joins me, former Deputy Prime Minister, who wrote in The Independent this week, why are our party leaders refusing to talk about Europe? Lord Heseltine, great to have you on the programme tonight. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Why is it dishonest for them not to be talking about Europe enough, in your view? That's an interesting choice of phrase.
Yes, and of course, increasingly, people are saying just that. The European movement has just published a poll showing that over half the people want Brexit on the agenda, Europe on the agenda. In the last week, we've seen Lady Lane Fox, President of the British Chamber of Commerce, saying that their members want to discuss this matter. We saw Danny Finkelstein in the Times. We saw Philip Stevens in the Financial Times writing articles saying that you can't escape in any discussion you have that is important to this country from our relationship with Europe. We can't defend ourselves alone. We can't control immigration alone. We can't deal with the climate change problems alone. We can't regenerate our economy alone. And so not to talk about this absolutely fundamental relationship is, frankly, dishonest.
So is what you're saying, Lord Heseltine, it's not about whether or not we're in the EU that you want the conversation to be about. It's more about what our relationship with Europe looks like, accepting that we have left.
Well, having left, we have deteriorated our situation. And the only way to recreate the advantages that I believe that the election should be about is in a closer relationship with Europe.
That is what the Lib Dems and Labour are promising, isn't it? So it's not that it's completely absent from the discussion at all.
Well, it's absent because at the moment all we're getting is platitudes.
Right.
And I can say I want to be nice to someone, I want to be closer to them, I want to talk to them. Doesn't mean anything until you actually say what you would propose to do, how you would do it, when you would do it. That's what an honest campaign would be about.
Why do you think the leaders are reluctant? I think, of course you are. You're right to say that they are. There is a sort of angst about talking about Europe. Why do you think that is?
Oh, it's quite clear. It's because the red wall seats, which moved from Labour to the Conservative, were persuaded to do so on the toxic issue of immigration. And immigration is a huge issue. It is going to get worse as more and more people realize that in Europe there is a honeypot which they want to share. I mean, let's be clear about immigrants. These are not what Donald Trump said, criminals and evil people. These are young, energetic people living in the third world who have all got their mobile phones on which they can see the standards of living that we enjoy. Now, we may think that those standards are not what we would like, but to them, it is unbelievable, and they want to come and share it. Now, I'm the first to recognize that you cannot accept the huge numbers that were involved, but I know perfectly well that we, in our own island capacity, are not able to deal with this issue. It needs a bigger European view. But the reason why the parties won't talk about the detail is because of the emergence of what was UKIP is now Reform. It is the voice of Nigel Farage. And frankly, we've had all this before. We saw it in the 1930s when Mosley marched with his black shirts. We saw it in the 1960s when Enoch Powell made that infamous speech. And now we've seen it again in UKIP and Reform.
You would put Nigel Farage and Richard Tice on par with the likes of Enoch Powell and Mosley?
Yes, of course, because what they are doing is exploiting that human anxiety that comes from something that is slightly different. And this is not new for us. Across the world, you can see tribalism and racism tearing communities apart to this day. And it is the easiest thing when you have economic pressure in a society. And we have, let's be frank, life is pretty difficult economically at the moment for many, many people. So you've got to find someone to blame. And that's when the Farage team move in. Who do they blame? Them, him, her, foreigners, bureaucrats.
But some would say that your own party leadership has been guilty of the same. That Rishi Sunak, Suella Braverman, James Cleverly, others, Robert Jenrick, they have also been guilty of using a not that dissimilar rhetoric when it comes to small boat crossings and immigration.
Yes, well, this is the problem, that because of the toxicity of this issue, there's a temptation for other parties to try and fend off the threat that they are weak on immigration. And it is, frankly, across the Western world, you see this drift to the right. And you see it in Donald Trump, particularly, with the most appalling language he's been using. But you can see it in Le Pen in France, the AFG in Germany.
Do you see it from your own party leadership, or do you think that's unfair?
No, I don't. I see it from all party leaderships.
You see it from Labour as well.
This is why this is a dishonest election campaign.
More broadly, what do you make of Rishi Sunak, Lord Heseltine? Are you impressed with his leadership? What do you make of him as a Prime Minister and leader of your party?
Well, I think that Rishi Sunak deserves a great deal of credit for a very brave decision, which has been part of the problem we've got. And let's be quite clear about it. He faced COVID. COVID was an unknown threat of unpredictable scale. And it's all very well now to look back and say, well, should we or should not have done this? When he was Chancellor, he knew that there was an unquantifiable risk to health, to jobs, to livelihoods. And so he spent a lot of money saving jobs, saving people's health, and the money had to be paid for. And one of the reasons why we have now got such high public borrowing and why taxes are higher than anybody actually wants is because he took those very lonely decisions. And
but he was
I think he was right to do that.
He was also, of course, he was a prominent Brexiteer. He is someone who in government has focused extensively on the Rwanda scheme, on immigration. Is there not an extent, Lord Heseltine, to which the problems you are talking about in British politics that Rishi Sunak has quite a lot of responsibility for, some might say?
Well, I've made it quite clear this is across the parties, this drift, excuse me, this drift to the right. I'm not going to single out any one person.
There's only one party that's talking about sending migrants to Rwanda.
No, but that's just a tiny microcosm of the problem. Anybody will have to try and cope with the small boats, and it cannot be an acceptable form of immigration into this country. So any government will have to deal with that. The Labour party doesn't have to say how because they're not in power, but they would have to say how.
Well, they still have got a plan, but it doesn't look like much of a plan to me, I've got to say.
Exactly.
Just going back to Brexit for a moment, do you think that part of the conversation that you want to take place should be about our membership of the European Union? I take your point about talking about collaborating, what that relationship might look like going forward. But would you like to sort of reopen the question of whether actually we should be back in the European Union?
Oh, I have no doubt at all that we should never have left. We were a pack of lies told as to what would happen. And the extraordinary thing is that it's now nearly 8 years. The Brexiteers have been in charge. They've had their hands on the levers of power, and they can't show any benefits from it at all. None of the things, the airy phrases they used have turned out. And the truth is that there were no plans. It was all a pack of lies. And the sooner we realise that, and public opinion is now realising it, the better. So could we rejoin tomorrow? No, we couldn't, because the negotiations would have to take place. But the stepping stones would be there. We can get back involved in the research programs of Europe. We can open up opportunities for young people to travel into Europe. And we could, and maybe we certainly should, we should become advanced, involved in the discussion about the defence of Europe. At the moment, our defence is based on the NATO alliance. No one is a greater admirer of that than I am. But could you be certain that the Americans would come with a Donald Trump presidency?
No, absolutely not. I think that's a very real fear, and it's one that hasn't really been addressed.
You have to talk about Europe.
Can you ever see a situation where, given what you've said about it, the concerns about immigration, the British people accept freedom of movement with the EU once again?
No, the Europeans themselves are going to have to deal with that. And already you can see the politics of it. But what I do believe, that if you are going to cope with immigration, and I think you have to, then it is conceivable that a plan could be devised which is based on what the Americans did after the end of the Second World War, a Marshall Aid program. You put together the aid programs of Europe, and collectively, the Europeans man the frontiers of Europe. But the deal that makes it different is that we say to the countries from which the immigrants are coming, this is our offer to help you rebuild or create and build wealth-creating opportunities in your country using our aid programs in order to persuade your young people to stay in their homes.
And in terms of those stepping stones towards more collaboration, totally hear what you're saying. When is the time for another referendum on whether or not we should rejoin, Lord Heseltine?
Well, I would wait to see the consolidation of public opinion. At the moment, public opinion is now recognises the mistake and is now pro-European. That's where the public opinion is today. Personally, if I was advising a government, I'd say, look, take it by step, argue the case, explain the problems, and let public opinion consolidate.
But within the next decade?
Oh, God, yes.
Within the next
yes.
5 years? Within the next parliament?
I would think in the next parliament, perfectly possible.
Another referendum on rejoining the European Union?
Yes,
so it might be only 10 years on from the decision to leave. Don't people want to move on? Just finally, Lord Heseltine, a lot of people scarred by the sort of wars of Brexit. People just want to move on, don't they?
Then you want to look at the detail of the poll, and the European movement poll is very interesting. The only people who are still anti-Europe now are over 75. And the younger they are, the more pro-European they are. Now, that is going to feed through into public opinion more widely. It already is, but it'll happen more widely. And so what I would advise governments to do is to build stepping stones back, but with conviction, and above all else, with a vision. Look, we are Europeans. We have been Europeans for as long as anyone can write the history of this country. And the idea that we can somehow operate in the world as a nation state with the limited resources that we possess, compared with the giants of America, China, increasingly India, who will be using their public resources, their state funds, their taxation revenues, to advance all sorts of technologies and defense capabilities. The only way we can credibly play a role in the world is as part of a European presence, a shared sovereignty, because sovereignty shared is bigger than any sovereignty we can enjoy ourselves.
Lord Heseltine, thank you so much for coming on. Really, really grateful for your time this afternoon. That's Lord Michael Heseltine, former Deputy Prime Minister, who's written in The Independent this week, why are our party leaders refusing to talk about Europe? You heard it there from the man himself. Is he right? The elephant in the room, Brexit. Our relationship with Europe not being discussed enough in this election. Do you want another referendum within the next 5 years about whether we should rejoin the EU? Or does that make you shudder and fill you with dread? We've been there, we've got through it, we've moved on. Is it really time to reopen that box of worms? Maybe you think it is.